Hey, good morning to those of you out there on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you here on the East Coast with me. It's a beautiful day. I'm excited about today's topic. I'm also excited about the day since it's nice and sunny out there. It gives me energy. We're going to be talking in a minute with Steve Koprince, but I do want to just encourage you. Let me just turn off my captions here before we get started. I want to encourage you to engage in chat. Yesterday, if you're here on the lives, yesterday we had a lot of people coming in from YouTube as well as LinkedIn. And one person reached out to me. They're like, oh, I've been watching you on YouTube, but I didn't realize how big the community was over in LinkedIn. I'll talk about this in a minute, but one of the values of this session that I do every day at noon is that you can connect with others. There's tons of people who come in. There's over 100 people, I think, registered, or right around 100 people registered for training today. And that's a network for you to be able to connect with in the federal market. So engage with people. One of the first ways to engage is just let us know who you are in the chat. Your company name, your core competency, 2 or 3 words is all you need in there, and that'd be great. Today, the topic today is how lawyers can be helpful to government contractors. But I wanted to back up for a second and make a recommendation and a tip today. If you haven't read 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, read it. I've been reading it over 20 years, and the first habit is be proactive. And one of the things I'm going to be talking to Steve about today is a proactive approach to looking at lawyers, for example. And lawyers just represent one level of experts that you might want to have support your government contracting firm, small businesses in particular, right? And so when you think about being proactive, it really is the difference between having a plan for what tomorrow is going to bring and reacting to whatever falls into your lap. Lawyers are kind of that same way, in my opinion, and I think maybe it's Steve's. I don't want to speak for him, but this idea that, yes, you can wait till you have a problem, or you can talk to them early. A good lawyer to me is similar to the way I sometimes describe IT, but any lawyer might be able to get you out of a problem, but a good lawyer can sit there and actually help you avoid getting in the problem in the first place. And so maybe that's a reason for talking to them early, beginning to build a relationship with them early. And really, this just goes back to being proactive. So in today's, it's not training. Today, it's a fireside chat with Steve. And today, we're going to be talking about, just from my perspective, how lawyers can help government contractors. I could have talked with Steve from many different angles, but I really believe that it's not if you're going to need a lawyer for your firm, it's when, right? And you don't want to see a lawyer as just a person who helps you get out of problems. You want to see them as somebody who can help your business have a strong foundation that enables you to grow larger and larger, if that's your goal in the federal market. So I put a couple of topics down that I'm going to try to drive through today with Steve. First thing is, I just wanted to ping, and by the way, this is not in order because I'm going to reserve the right to just bounce around. But I did want to talk to him about relationships. That's a key out there where you have networking and then informal relationships and then more formal relationships. So I wanted to pick his brain on that on your behalf. And then I wanted to talk about what I was just sharing. When is the time I should be thinking about lawyers, and maybe what are the type of scenarios that I could think about out there? And then as time permits, I'm going to go to my favorite part, which is lessons learned. One of the things I track on with Steve, I think on a weekly basis, he shares out on LinkedIn a ton of insight and wisdom around what is happening in the government space, especially from the legal perspective, right? And he shares these lessons out there. So I want to talk to him about a couple of those. The ones that I think could be really interesting and helpful to you. If you don't know who I am, my name is Neil McDonnell. I am the president of the GovCon Chamber of Commerce. I am the co-founder of GovCon in a Box, and I want to welcome you to my federal sales training, where I provide tips for success in the federal market. I also provide you a chance to network with others in the federal market. If you don't know this, there's over 100 people registered just for today's training. You can go in and connect with those people. Hey, I saw you were also interested in hearing what Steve had to say. I was there. I'd love to connect. See if there's a chance to go forward. So connect with people in the training. Also, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, subscribe to Government Contracting Success newsletter. I am going to mention this a little later, but I'll just mention Stephen Koprince. He also has a great newsletter. I subscribe to it. I read it. I sometimes am the first person who engages because I live on LinkedIn, but I watch his stuff. So make sure you subscribe to his newsletter and mine. Sorry, I didn't put that in there, Stephen. And then the last thing on this slide, I just wanted to say, come back tomorrow if you're interested in, especially if you're in the IT space. I'm bringing back Ziad from DataLocks, and they're going to be talking about, he's going to be talking about FedRAMP and this path to cloud services. I want to demystify FedRAMP for those of us who just aren't that familiar with it. And he is an expert in this space. I'm excited to have him come in. So go register for training on that. All right, last thing before I bring Steve here is, and I'm going to shout these companies out again tomorrow and Monday, so they're not buried. But I really want to congratulate 𝗚𝗔 Hill Consulting and Tri-Merge Consulting. These two companies in the last 24 hours have hit the 100 Club in the GovCon in a Box. In what GovCon in a Box is providing all small businesses, 360,000 or so right now, we provide you a visibility score, a federal visibility score. How visible are you to buyers? The score is 0 to 100, and these companies just hit 100. Look at this, though. Only 46 companies out of 360,000 have a perfect score. And that score is not what you do in my system. We're just giving you a tool to go analyze the government's systems to make sure you're visible where they're looking. So go check out GovCon in a Box so you can understand your visibility score and join us on the next level. Okay, I think that's good on the slides. Let me turn those guys off. And Steve, let me find you and bring you up. Actually, let me elevate you up to a full participant. Not just
I can be a little the guy in the corner. That's fine.
Right. Somehow I got to stop doing that to guests. I'm like, we're just putting you in your place.
Yeah, some people like to keep their lawyers small, you know, in the corners.
Right. They're there just like an age old.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I want to welcome you. And actually, just as a way for you to say hi to people is maybe I just start off with a question that I did not prepare you for at all. But when you think about the federal market and government contracting, what do you like about it? Like, why is this your world for a lot of your career?
Yeah, and then first things first, Neil, thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I love everything you're providing for government contractors. What a resource that you and your team have for everybody. And thank you to everyone for joining us. So, you know, government contracting, you know, for me, and this is just for me, when it really became more of a passion and something that I follow even in my free time when I'm on vacation. I'm like, let's see what's going on, you know, with the, was really when I started working with small businesses, you know, and that was a few years into my career when I started, went from being an associate attorney who's just doing kind of the grunt work and learning, and that's all well and good. And then there's interesting pieces of that role as well. But when I started having the opportunity to work one-on-one with small business owners and officers who were, in some cases, veterans, they're women, they're coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, and they're doing one thing, and that is try to grow and develop in this space, which is a wonderful space to be in, but it's also really complicated and complex. And it started to feel good to be able to help those folks get and achieve their dreams, and that really is what made it personal for me, was to work with the people, you know, with the people, and provide them resources, tools, information, assistance to help them go from a dream to a successful business. And that's really what it's about for me.
No, that's awesome. I appreciate that. And just to put it in perspective for everybody, I mentioned this actually, I might have even skipped the whole part about me being a government contractor for 20 years in my intro. But I did have my own businesses, government contracting, small businesses. And on my shelf was Steve's book for when he wrote it through the last part of my second company. And he's been this person that before I used to take advice more legally, watching what he was saying and swimming in his world. And lately, I've just been a huge fan of just tracking on your stuff, Steve. And for everybody else out there, it's such a good thing to be able to observe experts. And so I like digging into the content you put out there, especially on LinkedIn. I know you're on 𝗚𝗏ology teaching and some other places that people can find you. But I want to pick your brain on some of the things I haven't heard you talk as much about, but actually it might be a lead into the event you're about to do too. So feel free to plug that. But I want to go to teaming, not teaming necessarily, but relationships. This idea in the federal market, we call it competimates. Sometimes we're competitors, sometimes we're teaming or teammates. But there's levels of relationships, the way I describe it, where you're networking and then you're starting to have maybe unofficial relationships, and then you're moving into more formal or informal to formal. I want to pick your brain on some of those things. For example, just starting with the difference between, and feel free to take this question any way you want, but teaming and JVs, right? There's this question about what's the difference between subcontracting, teaming, and JVing, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and that's we're not getting into the good time to talk to a lawyer, but that is actually a good time if you're thinking about that to have that conversation with somebody about what the different legal forms are and what the advantages, disadvantages, et cetera, are. But big picture wise, the difference is who's the prime contractor. Who is the prime contractor? Because when you have a prime subcontractor relationship, you've got one company here that's on top that has the relationship with the government. They're the one who are legally responsible for the entire contract. And then below them, there's a subcontractor who, prime is taking some of the work and pushing it down to the subcontractor, along with certain, at least if they're doing it right, with certain flow down clauses and things that the government says, okay, all your subcontractors also have to abide by Davis-Bacon Act if it's a construction project, for example, that sort of thing. So it's a hierarchy. It's a relationship where one company has a relationship totality and obligation with the government, and then is managing somebody who is below them in the hierarchy. When you have a joint venture, what I call a joint venture, at least under the SBA's rules, which is how most folks are setting them up these days, where small businesses are going after procurements. A joint venture, I call that a legal fiction of sorts, because what a joint venture essentially is it is a vehicle by which two companies can both be the prime contractor. And the way they do that is by forming a third entity, which is usually a shell company of sorts. We don't call it that if you're talking to SBA, but that's basically what it is. It's called unpopulated. It's usually a limited liability company, LLC, and it's owned by the two members of the joint venture. And then the government, because the government can't award a prime contract, a single contract to two companies, it can be multiple award contracts. We're not talking about that. It's one contract. Who does the government award it to? It awards it to the joint venture, but the joint venture is just the sum of its parts. It performs the work through its members, assuming it's one of these unpopulated joint ventures, which most are. And what that does is it allows both parties to be at the prime contract level and have a direct relationship of sorts with the government. Now they're still splitting the work, and the SBA has all sorts of rules if you're following, under those types of rules to get the advantage of small business status or 8A status or whatever you're trying to take advantage of. But it allows that to happen, where both companies can essentially be the prime contractor. And there are differences in terms of the work share requirements. How, if you're a large business, you may be able to get more work share as a joint venture member than you might as a subcontractor. So that may be one reason that a large business, for example, wants to be a joint venturer. So there are all sorts of different reasons why you might pick one over the other. But that's essentially, from a structural standpoint, what the difference is. One company being the prime contractor versus sort of, in effect, both companies being prime contractors.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's funny. It wasn't really normal when I was a government contractor, like JVs and any of that stuff is very unusual. It's almost getting to be 10 years since my last company. Actually, let me hit you with a couple of really quick questions just related to the JV, and then move on maybe to another part of this is when you think about a JV and you're describing this, and if I think you know everything, but if you don't, that's okay. But when you think about a JV, does it allow you to be able to go after opportunities that require a TS clearance, that the JV has it, or the contract vehicles of the primes? Do you got any insight on that?
Yeah, excellent question. That's been a subject of debate and push, between, the DCSA that's doing security clearances and the SBA. And there have been some push on that, and more recently, at least supposedly, some agreement as to what that looks like. And so this is the idea about, okay, if you've got a facility security clearance, FCL, can the JV essentially use the clearance of its members? Does it need its own clearance, et cetera, et cetera? So where they seem to have come out on an agreement, and I say seem because it's not clear to me that all contracting officers are necessarily following the memo or agreement that SBA and the DoD have come up with on this subject, is that if both members of the joint venture have the appropriate level of FCL, for example, they both have the top secret FCL, then the joint venture does not need a separate FCL, because that wouldn't make any sense. It's an empty entity, it's unpopulated, it has its own facilities, and so it's only performing the work for its members. Both members are cleared. Okay. So that makes total sense. The second piece of that is that if only one of the members is cleared, and often in a mentor-protege joint venture, it's the mentor, the larger business, that is cleared, not always, then the joint venture cannot just simply walk in and start using the mentor's security clearance. Why? Because that is a national security risk. Something you have an uncleared company, which is doing at least 40% of the joint venture's work. That's what the requirement is. That's only doing cleared work without ever going through the security clearance process. So it clearly makes sense that no, a protege cannot just start using its mentor's FCL. Now there is a provision in the SBA regulations that says, and this I think is where DoD maybe gets a little bit of heartburn, is that if only one member of the joint venture has the clearance, but only a piece of the work requires the clearance, and you can lop that work off for the cleared member, then that could be okay too. And I don't know that everybody at DoD is
entitled. No, that's too crazy. Yeah.
With that. So, but bottom line for most people's sake is, if both members are cleared, that should be fine. There are some contract officers who may push back on that, but that's something that a lawyer could help write a letter like, hey, Regulation X says you can't do that you have to accept clearance, and JV doesn't need its own clearance. If only one member is cleared, then no, the uncleared member cannot start quote unquote using the clearance of the cleared member, because as you follow the logical thread, that's a huge national security nightmare.
No, that's perfect. And actually, yesterday afternoon, I was in a call. Somebody asked me that question about TS facility and a JV, and I said, well, first, I don't know. But here's my understanding. And then tomorrow, I happen to be on with Steve.
Here's the guy who's I'm going to put him on the spot and ask him this question.
Unfortunately, I got it right. I was like, if you both have it, it works. But if you don't, then the rationale just makes so much sense. And for the most part, if people follow rationale, it's good. So speaking of the expertise of lawyers, let's shift a little bit into I've been talking about since 2018 small business maturity, and that small business owners, when they come in, they can't sit there and see themselves. And I actually made this mistake, but they can't pretend that they're a billion-dollar company. I used to use this line, billion-dollar company, revenues not yet recognized. It's like, no, you're a small company with no money. It's like, you got to recognize that's where you're at, because then you start doing the things that you can instead of trying to do the stuff that's up here. But small business maturity, part of that is beginning to figure out when to engage with a lawyer, law firm, and not just troubled areas, but actually just for maturity of the organization. Instead of hiring a lawyer, you reach out to firms like your old one, et cetera. When's some of the times we should be thinking about a lawyer as you think about the growth of a company?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and yeah, the fact is that lawyers are not cheap. Even my firm, my former firm, and I'm no longer practicing law, so I don't have any skin in the game. So when I say you should hire a lawyer, people shouldn't take that as you're trying to pitch me to call me Stephen Koprince, because I don't practice anymore. Although I'm happy to give references to folks. But yeah, lawyers are not cheap, and so when you have zero cash, you just literally can't afford a lawyer. Then you literally can't afford a lawyer. But as you start growing, then it becomes a cost that you need to, at least I think you ought to take into account. And you talked a little bit about this at the outset, on a proactive basis. And what are some areas? Where are some areas where it would make sense to hire a lawyer proactively rather than reactively after there's a problem? That's what most people call a lawyer for the first time, when there's some legal problem. And so one common example is with governing documents of your company, operating agreements, bylaws, those sorts of documents, especially if you're going to go for any sort of socioeconomic type status, like SDVOSB, like 8A, et cetera. Those programs have very specific requirements about what your governing documents to look like. And so that is not a great place to go it alone if you can afford not to. That getting expert advice from somebody who knows the regulations that those agreements have to follow, as well as someone who can help you with the practical aspects of it, is in terms of, okay, well, we have 3 owners of this company. How are we going to split the profits? Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that looks like, so that you have a document that works well for you. And so, that anytime that you've got a legal document, and if you can afford it, it's good to have a experienced lawyer at least review the document, if not draft it for you to begin with. What you're going to get from the internet is just not going to be, especially if you're going for a certification like SDUSB, up to snuff. And so what happens a lot of times, what's happened in my experience, is that people don't do that. They then submit the document to SBA for certification, and it gets turned around, and that's when they call the lawyer, like, oh my gosh, they said my document was terrible and I have to get it all revised, and oh my, now that I have the bad document, I also made all these other decisions that were based on the document that I have to unwind. And so you end up spending more money on the back end trying to fix something than you would have paid on the front end. A second example, I'll just give you a second example.
Yeah.
And I think this is a situation where you should be able to afford a lawyer to do this is with joint venture agreements. And we just talked about that topic. Well, it turns out that joint venture agreements, the SBA has very, very strict requirements about what needs to be in a joint venture agreement. And those requirements continue to be tweaked every few years, and they can vary depending on the status of the contract you're going after. For example, if you're going after a small business set aside, the SBA has a couple of requirements that are different than if you're going after an 8A set aside contract for the joint venture agreement itself. And so a lot of folks, they get a template from somewhere that's floating around on the internet, or their mentor has one, and they assume, well, you're a large business, you must know what you're doing. That's not always true. And so what happens is they sign this joint venture agreement that's deficient in some way. SBA has 15 to 18 requirements, depending on how you look at sub requirements that have to be in there. And you miss one of them, you miss two of them, whatever the case is. You bid on the contract, you win your contract, somebody challenges your award, they file a protest against your award. What happens in that case? Your contract goes away. End of story. Because your joint venture agreement wasn't compliant as of the date of the bid, and there's absolutely nothing that a lawyer can do to save your contract at that point. Once it gets protested and your agreement was not valid as of the date of the bid, not 100% compliant, you can fix it for the next contract. I could do that, but I can't save your award. And that's a tough conversation as a lawyer to have with somebody who I know I could have helped them a couple months ago write a compliant agreement. Now they're calling me saying, oh, I'm being protested, help me save my contract. And I look at their agreement and I don't have a time machine. I can't do it. I can't save their contract. It's going away because the agreement wasn't compliant as the date. So that's another example of a situation where please hire a lawyer to do a joint venture agreement, please. And because one mistake and the contract goes bye-bye. And that's a really tough, it's tougher for the client, but tough for me too to have to tell somebody that I can't do anything. I can't help them.
No, that's horrible. And actually, just for the audience, that's one of the things that attracts me to Steve's content a lot on LinkedIn that I read, is because I'm not an expert in there. Right? I'm a government expert who is in sales. I don't even say I'm a proposal expert. I'm in the BD and capture side. That's my area of expertise. And like law, you can be a lawyer. You're an expert lawyer, but you're not an expert in every part of the law. And for me, I follow his content constantly because I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. And the minute you read it, you get an aha moment. And what you're talking about really hits home. These aren't just little bitty expenses you're worried about. It could impact whether you have a contract down the road or whether you're moving forward. And that's super important. One thing I did want to just say to the audience too, is that listening to you talk, Steve, and we're talking about lawyers are expensive. I learned this a long time ago in the government. I think I learned it when I was in the Army, is that there's a huge difference between cost and price. So an example is if you think about getting a new radiation machine or something, or imaging machine for the VA hospital, the price is $100,000, but the cost is $1 million over the life of the thing because I have to keep buying the film and ink or whatever. And for lawyers, I would sit there and say the price might seem higher than a $50 an hour help desk person, but the ROI is clearly there. But the cost of missing that is huge. And I think those of us, and I'm in that same group, who might avoid investing in legal advice from a lawyer, accountant, whatever, we forget the fact that we just paid $1,000 to go to a conference or $2,000 to go to a conference. It's like, really look at that. We got like 7 minutes left. And Steve, I want to pull you to some of the stuff I like best about what I follow you for. And it's what you were just kind of talking about. You often do, and correct me if I'm saying it kind of the wrong way, but looking into GAO reports and these protests that happen and giving us your summary of what happened and lessons learned. First off, can you just level set what you're looking into and share, and then maybe share one or two that really pop up?
Yeah, and so the GAO is like a U.S. Government Accountability Office, and one of their functions is to resolve disputes about contract awards. And so if not all disputes are within their jurisdiction, but many are. And so if a company X is named as the awardee of a contract, and company Y thinks that award decision was flawed in some respect, either because company X they think it wasn't eligible for the contract, or company Y thinks their proposal was misevaluated in some way, then company Y has the opportunity to go to GAO, which is an administrative body operating under Congress actually, and ask the GAO to review that. And what GAO does is it will, assuming that the protest meets all the technical requirements for filing and timeliness and all that stuff, they're pretty strict deadlines, then it will review those allegations and issue a decision as to what happens. You say, well, why do I care? Why do I care if company X wants that contract or company Y? Because oftentimes these protests have a lot of lessons learned for folks that are in there. You find out the company Y didn't, loses its protest, and the reason is because there was a 25-page limit, and their proposal went to 26, and so the agency just lopped off page 26 and wouldn't look at it, and GAO says, yeah, as they should have. And so now like, hey, I got to be really careful. And so there's lots of little things that pop up that are, lessons learned for contractors who, for one reason or another, either successfully protest somebody else's contract or have lost a contract. And you say, man, this is something that people ought to know. They ought to know this about the page limits, for example, that they're going to be evaluated really strictly. They ought to know that if they see an ambiguity in a solicitation where, section B1 says the period of performance is 6 months and section B3 says it's 12 months, and you don't resolve that on the front end, good luck on the back end. I mean, you're not going to be able to resolve that after you wait and see what happens if you get awarded the contract. And so there are lots of little lessons learned. And what I try to do when I'm writing about a protest, which is not always, is encapsulated from that way. Nobody cares in the contracting world, at least I don't think so. Most people don't care about all the procedural history and this, blah, blah, blah. What they care about or should care about is what went wrong for somebody in this case, or in some cases what went right, and what can we learn from that. And that's what I try to focus on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do, is kind of go into your content and kind of scour your content and pull out the Steve wisdoms and send people back to your articles, because I love your newsletter. And I would encourage, I can see our chat's a little wonky. Sometimes technology just goes, but I know the chat on LinkedIn is working. And so somebody put into the chat the link to Steve's newsletter, or just put newsletter and I'll send it to you afterwards. If I just hit you with a kind of a faster one, we get 3 minutes, but that's so much time. Just sticking with protest for 1 second. Should I protest? Should I not protest? Any high level tip on protesting? Yeah,
and so there are different schools of thought on this, of course. And first things first, this is an area where get yourself a lawyer. I mean, this is a process in which some folks will say, I'm going to get blackballed if I protest. I don't think that's true. And by the way, if a certain contract officer blackballs you for filing a good faith protest, then you probably don't want to work with that person anyway. But the protest rules and what is a valid basis of protest are so nuanced that if you try to do this on your own, number one, you're likely going to lose. And there's statistics that were published a few years ago showing that people who did their own protests are much more likely to lose than if they had a lawyer, obviously. But second, you run the risk of filing what you believe is a good faith protest, but to the recipient, the agency, looks like a frivolous protest because they know the rules and are like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And so, in my career, I filed many, many protests, but I suspect, I didn't keep count, that I talked more people out of protests than I filed them. Because when they called me, then we had a heart-to-heart about what their allegations were, what the likelihood of success was, all those sorts of things. So getting that sort of read up front is really important. And I think most lawyers, I certainly would do this, would say that the protest can vary on the circumstances that you face, but there are sometimes opportunities to try to resolve these informally before protesting. For example, if you have concerns about the contents of a solicitation, you can protest the terms of the solicitation, but unless it was an unusual situation, would not do that without first trying to resolve that informally with the contracting officer, saying, hey, contracting officer, we have a concern with this part. Can you get back to me and say whether you're going to consider revising it? And if they say no, now at least you've given them a good faith opportunity to do that. So from a relationship perspective, I think it's better. But also a good chunk of the time that actually works. Like I had plenty of times where I reached out to a contracting officer and said, hey, this looks like a flaw in the solicitation. And you know what? They never said the words I agree, because that's too much. But they would say, please see amendment 002. And it would fix the issue.
No, I like that. I think most lawyers would probably, one of their first pieces of advice or questions is, did you talk it out? Did you?
Right. And if we go straight to the protest, then I'm not doing my job for you, which is to get you a result, not to
Not
get
to
you in a
protest,
process that you don't need.
yeah. Hey, we're out of time, but I want to, and I really appreciate you being here. If I did an hour show, I would invest a lot more time thanking you. But you're awesome. I'm a huge fan. I'm going to make sure people who are in my world obviously know who you are. But you've got an event coming up, and I want to make sure people are just tracking on that. Do you want to share a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you so much for the kind words. And it goes both ways. Like I said, everything you're doing is outstanding, and what a resource for the community out there. So yeah, we've got an event coming up September 25th in Tyson's Corner in the DC area that afternoon from, I believe it's 3 to 6:30 is the official time. We've got a roundtable going on about the SBA's mentor protege program and joint ventures under the program. So the idea is to provide my advice, but also from several other experts who are going to be on this panel about how you can form and successfully pursue and win work using a mentor protege joint venture and do it in a compliant fashion, which of course is the sort of stuff that I'm raising my hand for with those tricky rules and that sort of thing. So I'm real excited about this event. Looks like there's going to be a great turnout for it. And so I'm happy to provide information on that for anyone who hasn't seen it. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can provide you the links to that event. You can see the details and register there.
Yeah, that's perfect. And just advice, if you're reaching out on LinkedIn, make sure you're just giving him context, because a lot of us get a lot of connection requests, and it helps us when we see context like, hey, I'm interested in your event. Doesn't have to be a lot of words, just some words that says something that he can tell the difference between spam and me, right? And so do that. I'll repost yours without comment, because it'll push out to my network as well. But Steve, I really appreciate this. I'm hoping you hang out for a second. I'm going to turn the camera off, close down, and then come back and talk to you if you got a minute.
Absolutely.
But thank you very much. I will talk to you afterwards. For everybody else, because we're out of time, just remember, government contracting, it is not a secret. It's just a process. I will see you in the next training.